Dmitry Volkov was the most experienced solo climber in the Soviet Mountaineering Federation. At 34, he had conquered every major peak in the Caucasus Range without a single rescue call or injury requiring medical attention. His technique was flawless, his equipment was always perfect, and his route planning was so thorough that other climbers used his maps as gospel. When he set out to photograph the remote northern face of Mount Dombai-Olgun on March 15, 1987, he carried enough supplies for 12 days and emergency beacons that could signal rescue teams from 40 miles away. But rescue teams never received his signal because Dmitry Volkov never activated his beacon. The camera found in 2019 by climate researchers proved he was alive and conscious for nearly a week after his fall. Yet he never once tried to call for help, even though his emergency transmitter was working perfectly, and rescue teams were actively searching for him. The photographs tell a different story entirely. The fall happened on day 3 of his expedition. Volkov was photographing ice formations when a snow bridge collapsed beneath his feet, sending him tumbling 60 feet down into a crevasse that geological surveys later measured as only 18 inches wide at its narrowest point. The impact broke his left leg in 2 places and cracked 3 ribs. But the real problem was the walls. They were too close together for him to climb and too smooth to provide any grip. The opening above was too narrow for anyone to reach down and pull him up. Volkov's expedition journal, found with his body, recorded his situation with scientific precision. Day 1 after the fall, temperature minus 22 degrees, leg immobilized, with tent poles, pain manageable with medication. Day 2, began rationing food and water, tested emergency beacon signal strength. Day 3, heard helicopter overhead but could not see it through crevasse opening, decided to save beacon battery power. Day 4, photographed ice wall formations for documentation purposes. Day 5, severe dehydration symptoms, began melting snow for water. Day 6, final journal entry simply reads, visitor. The visitor appeared on day 6. Frame 36 of Volkov's camera shows a person standing approximately 15 feet above him, wearing dark winter clothing and facing directly toward the camera. The figure is too far away and too shadowed to identify gender or facial features, but the positioning is deliberate. This is not an accidental capture of someone walking past. The person is standing still, looking down at Volkov, clearly aware of his presence. What makes this photograph terrifying is not what it shows, but what it proves. Someone found Dmitry Volkov alive in that crevasse. Someone stood close enough to lower a rope, close enough to radio for rescue teams, close enough to save his life. Someone looked down at a dying man and chose to walk away. The camera's internal clock stamp shows the photograph was taken at 3:47 p.m. on March 21st, 1987. Volkov's body was found by researchers on July 15th, 2019, perfectly preserved by the glacial ice that had kept him frozen for 32 years. His emergency beacon was still functional and fully charged. His radio worked perfectly. His rescue flares were unused and dry. When climate change accelerated glacial melting in the Caucasus region, Volkov's crevasse opened wide enough for research teams to rappel down and recover his remains. The camera was wrapped in waterproof, housing and attached to his chest with climbing rope. The film inside was still intact, protected by the sub-zero temperatures and complete darkness. 23 of the 36 photographs show normal expedition documentation, mountain vistas, ice formations, equipment checks. 8 photographs show the interior of the crevasse from various angles, clearly documenting his trapped position and the impossibility of self-rescue. 4 photographs show his own injuries, the compound fracture of his left tibia, the massive bruising across his torso, the frostbite damage to his fingers. 1 photograph shows the mysterious visitor. The Soviet Mountaineering Federation records show that no other climbers were authorized to be in the Mount Dombai-Olgun area during March 1987. Weather stations reported blizzard conditions that grounded all aircraft for 6 days during the exact period of Volkov's entrapment. The nearest hiking trail was 18 miles away across terrain that required technical climbing equipment to traverse. But someone was there. Someone found him. Someone looked down at Dmitry Volkov lying broken and dying in a glacial tomb and decided his life was not worth saving. The geometric measurements taken from the photograph prove the visitor was not an optical illusion or camera malfunction. Using the known dimensions of the crevasse opening and Volkov's height as reference points, photographic analysts calculated the figure to be approximately 5 feet 8 inches tall and positioned 11 to 16 feet above the camera. The shadows cast by the figure match the sun angle recorded by the camera's light meter at 3:47 p.m. on March 21st. Volkov's final journal entry, written in careful block letters despite his deteriorating condition, contains only 7 words. Visitor came today. They saw me. Left. Below this, in handwriting that becomes increasingly shaky, he added, emergency supplies full, radio works, beacon strong. Someone chose this. The rescue equipment analysis revealed the most damning evidence. Volkov carried professional climbing, gear rated for rescues in exactly this type of situation. His rope was 200 feet of static line capable of supporting 8,000 pounds. His ascenders and pulleys could have lifted him out of the crevasse with minimal effort from someone above. His emergency medical kit included morphine, antibiotics, and splinting materials that could have stabilized his injuries for transport. All of this equipment was found unused. Not because Volkov was unconscious or unable to communicate his need for rescue, but because the visitor never acknowledged his calls for help. The most haunting detail emerged from the camera's motor drive settings. The Nikon F3 was configured for automatic exposure and focus, meaning Volkov only had to press the shutter button to take a photograph, but frame 36 shows perfect manual focus on the visitor, with careful attention to depth of field and composition. This was not a panic shot or desperate attempt to document his situation. Volkov took time to properly focus and frame this photograph because he wanted to create clear evidence of what happened. He wanted the world to know that someone let him die. The visitor's clothing provides additional clues that investigators found disturbing. The dark winter jacket and pants visible in the photograph match the standard issue cold weather gear distributed to Soviet mountain rescue teams in 1987. The person's stance and positioning suggest familiarity with crevasse rescue techniques. This was not a lost hiker or accidental discovery. This was someone with training and equipment who understood exactly what they were looking at. Mountain rescue protocols in 1987 required immediate radio contact with base stations whenever a victim was discovered in a crevasse. Emergency procedures mandated that rescue personnel never leave the scene of a trapped climber without either completing the rescue or establishing continuous communication with evacuation teams. The visitor violated every established protocol by leaving Volkov to die. The weather data from March 21st, 1987, shows perfect rescue conditions. Wind speeds were under 10 miles per hour. Visibility was unlimited, and temperatures reached -8 degrees, well, within the operating range for helicopter evacuations. The visitor could have called for professional rescue teams who would have reached Volkov's location within 2 hours. Instead, they chose to become a murderer. Volkov's climbing background makes his helplessness even more tragic. He held instructor certifications in technical rescue and had personally saved 14 climbers from similar situations during his career. His equipment knowledge was encyclopedic, and his rope work was flawless. Under normal circumstances, he could have self-rescued from this crevasse using techniques he had taught hundreds of students. But the compound fractures in his leg made climbing impossible. The internal injuries from his fall prevented him from maintaining the core strength needed for rope ascension. He needed help from above, and that help stood 15 feet away and chose to watch him die. The psychological profile developed by forensic analysts reveals the deliberate nature of the visitor's actions. The person remained at the crevasse site long enough to assess Volkov's condition, determine his need for rescue, and make a conscious decision to abandon him. The photograph shows the visitor facing directly toward the camera, suggesting awareness that their image was being captured. This was not cowardice or panic. This was calculated murder by abandonment. The camera's film advance mechanism proves Volkov remained conscious for at least 18 hours after the visitor departed. Frames 37 through 39 were attempted, but contain only darkness, indicating he continued trying to document his situation even after his final working photograph. The camera's battery died before he did. Dmitry Volkov's frozen body showed no signs of hypothermia-induced delirium or disorientation. His journal entries remained coherent until the end. His equipment was organized and accessible. He knew exactly what was happening to him, and he knew someone had chosen to let it happen. The visitor's identity remains unknown. Soviet mountaineering records from 1987 show no registered climbers in the area during the relevant time period. Military exercise logs indicate no training operations within 50 miles of Mount Dombai-Olgin. Weather station personnel were accounted for at their posts throughout. March. Someone was there illegally, or someone lied about their location. The glacial ice that preserved Volkov's body for 32 years has now completely melted due to climate change. The crevasse that trapped him has opened into a 60-foot wide canyon that no longer poses any danger to climbers. The physical evidence of his death has been erased by rising global temperatures, leaving only the photographs and the question of who could look down at a dying man and choose to walk away. The last entry in Dmitry Volkov's climbing journal, written with a pencil stub in handwriting that took forensic analysts 3 weeks to decipher, contains a final message. Film and camera. Frame 36 shows them. Someone will find this. Someone will know what they did. My name is Dmitry Volkov. I did not have to die alone. He was wrong. He did have to die alone because someone decided his life was not worth the effort of making a phone call. But he was right about one thing. Someone did find him. Someone does know what happened. And now the world knows that somewhere, a person who could have been a hero chose to become a killer instead. The investigation that followed the discovery of Volkov's remains revealed additional evidence that made the visitor's actions even more inexcusable. The camera's internal memory chip, a backup system that few people knew existed in 1987 models, contained metadata showing that someone had handled the camera while Volkov was still alive. Digital forensic analysis revealed fingerprints on the camera body that did not match Volkov's prints, proving the visitor had not only seen him, but had physically interacted with his equipment. The fingerprint analysis took 18 months to complete because the prints were partial and degraded by decades of ice exposure. But 3 ridge patterns were clear enough for identification purposes. Those prints belonged to someone who was still alive, someone who left their mark on a dying man's camera and then walked away. The forensic timeline, reconstructed from the camera data, shows the visitor spent at least 43 minutes at the crevasse site. This was not a brief encounter or momentary hesitation. The person had enough time to assess the situation completely, examine Volkov's condition, and make multiple decisions about how to respond. They chose abandonment every single time. Temperature sensors built into the camera housing recorded the exact thermal conditions during the visitor's presence. The readings show that someone's body heat was detected within 3 feet of the camera for extended periods. The visitor was close enough to hand Volkov food, water, or medical supplies. Close enough to hear his voice clearly when he called for help. Close enough to see the pain in his eyes. The most damning evidence came from spectral analysis of the photograph itself. Modern digital enhancement revealed details invisible to the naked eye in 1987. The visitor was carrying a radio, antenna that extended above their shoulder line, communication equipment that could have reached rescue stations from that location, equipment that remained unused while Volkov died slowly in the ice below. The antenna configuration, visible in frame 36, matches the standard Soviet emergency broadcasting equipment issued to mountain rescue personnel between 1985 and 1989. The radio system had a range of 60 miles in mountain terrain and was designed specifically for coordinating evacuations from remote locations. The visitor had the exact tools needed to save Volkov's life and chose not to use them. But the radio evidence revealed something even worse. The visitor was not alone. Enhanced digital analysis of frame 36 shows a second shadow visible in the background, indicating that 2 people found Volkov in the crevasse. 2 people made the decision to let him die. 2 people walked away carrying the knowledge that they had committed murder through inaction. The second person's presence was confirmed by footprint analysis conducted when researchers returned to the site in 2020. Glacial melting had exposed the ground where the visitors had stood, and the permafrost had preserved boot impressions from 1987. 2 distinct sets of prints, both wearing Soviet military-issue winter boots, both positioned directly above the crevasse opening. Both sets of prints showed evidence of prolonged standing, proving neither person was simply passing by. The boot impressions revealed additional details about the visitor's behavior. The larger set of prints showed pacing patterns consistent with someone who remained at the site for over an hour. The smaller prints remained stationary in one location, suggesting someone who stood and observed without moving. Both sets of prints included deeper heel impressions, typical of someone carrying heavy equipment, likely the rescue gear that was never used. Soil analysis from beneath the boot. Prints contained fabric fibers that matched Soviet rescue team uniforms from the 1980s. The visitors were not random hikers or lost climbers. They were trained professionals with the equipment, knowledge, and authority to save lives. They were the exact people Volkov would have expected to rescue him. The psychological evaluation of the crime scene revealed the calculated nature of the abandonment. The visitors positioned themselves where they could observe Volkov clearly. While remaining outside the range of his voice, they maintained visual contact without engaging in communication. This behavior pattern is consistent with individuals who wanted to watch someone die without accepting responsibility for their death. The distance calculations prove the visitors could hear Volkov's calls for help. Sound carries exceptionally well in the acoustic environment of a glacial crevasse, and the opening was narrow enough to amplify voices from below. The visitors would have heard every word Volkov spoke, every plea for rescue, every expression of pain and desperation. They listened to him beg for his life and chose to let him suffer. The timeline reconstruction shows the visitors departed the scene just before sunset on March 21st. They had spent the entire afternoon watching Volkov die slowly, making multiple opportunities to intervene and choosing inaction each time. Their departure timing suggests they waited until they were certain he would not survive the night without assistance. But Volkov did survive that night, and the next night, and 3 more nights after that. The visitor's timing was wrong, which means they forced him to endure additional days of suffering that could have been prevented. Their attempt to avoid witnessing his death only prolonged his agony. The medical examination of Volkov's remains revealed the full extent of his suffering during those final days. Tissue analysis showed severe dehydration that would have caused excruciating cramping and kidney failure, Bone marrow samples indicated prolonged hypothermia that would have felt like being burned alive from the inside. Stomach contents revealed he had been reduced to eating snow mixed with dirt to survive. The visitors knew this would happen. Medical training was mandatory for all Soviet rescue personnel, and the symptoms of exposure death were covered extensively in certification programs. The visitors understood exactly what kind of death they were inflicting on Volkov by abandoning him in the crevasse. The most horrifying discovery came from analyzing the rope fibers found in Volkov's hands. Chemical testing revealed synthetic polymers that matched Soviet rescue rope manufactured in 1986. Someone had lowered a rope into the crevasse during the visitors' presence. Someone had given Volkov hope that rescue was imminent. Then someone had pulled the rope back up and left him to die. The psychological torture of this action cannot be overstated. Volkov believed he was being rescued. He prepared himself for evacuation, organized his equipment for retrieval, and gathered his strength for the rope climb that would save his life. The rope's withdrawal would have been more devastating than never seeing hope at all. The fiber analysis proved the rope was lowered at least 15 feet into the crevasse, close enough for Volkov to grab, but not close enough for him to secure himself for rescue. This was not an accident or a miscommunication. Someone deliberately dangled salvation in front of a dying man and then snatched it away. The investigation revealed that 4 Soviet rescue teams were conducting training exercises within 30 miles of Mount Dombai-Ulgen during March 1987. All 4 teams reported their personnel were accounted for during the period of Volkov's entrapment. Someone lied in those reports, or someone was operating outside official channels. The training records show that rope rescue techniques were being practiced extensively during that month, with special emphasis on crevasse evacuations. The timing suggests the visitors might have been using Volkov as a practice scenario, treating his real emergency as a training exercise. When they decided his situation was too difficult or time-consuming, they simply walked away. The equipment. Inventory from those training exercises included radio systems identical to the one visible in frame 36. Rope specifications matched the fibers found in Volkov's hands. Boot sizes corresponded to the impressions found at the crevasse site. Every piece of physical evidence pointed to one conclusion. Official rescue personnel abandoned Dmitry Volkov to die. The cover-up began immediately after. Volkov was reported missing. Search and rescue operations were conducted in the wrong area, despite his filed route plan clearly indicating his intended destination. Aircraft searches focused on valleys miles away from his actual location. Ground. Teams were deployed to regions that experienced climbers knew were impossible to reach in winter conditions. The misdirection was not accidental. Someone with authority over search operations deliberately sent rescue teams away from Volkov's location. Someone who knew exactly where he was because they had already found him and chosen to leave him there. The radio logs from the search period show anomalous transmissions on emergency frequencies during the exact hours when the visitors were at Volkov's location. The transmissions were too brief and distorted for content analysis, but their timing proves someone was broadcasting from the crevasse area while rescue teams searched elsewhere. Those brief radio contacts could have been Volkov trying to signal for help, or the visitors communicating with handlers who were coordinating the cover-up. Either scenario proves that rescue was possible and was deliberately prevented by people who had the power to save his life. The visitor in frame 36 is still alive. They are still free. They are still carrying the memory of looking down at Dmitry Volkov and choosing to let him die. Their accomplice is also alive, also free, also carrying the knowledge of their crime. 2 people walked away from a crevasse in 1987, knowing they had committed the perfect murder. And somewhere in their minds, they can still hear him calling for help. They can still see his face looking up at them from the ice. They can still remember the moment they decided his life was not worth saving. They know that Dmitry Volkov's death was not an accident or an unavoidable tragedy. It was a choice, and they made it deliberately. The forensic reconstruction of Volkov's final hours revealed details that make the visitor's abandonment even more monstrous. His body position, when found, indicated he had attempted to climb the crevasse walls repeatedly during his final day alive. The ice showed fresh scratch marks from his fingernails, gouges from his belt buckle, and bloodstains from injuries sustained during desperate escape attempts. He never stopped fighting for his life, even after the visitors had condemned him to death. The scratch marks formed a pattern that told the complete story of his final struggle. They started 8 feet above the crevasse floor, showing he had managed to climb that high, using pure upper body strength despite his broken leg. The marks continued in clusters every few inches, documenting each failed attempt to gain purchase on the smooth ice walls. The highest marks reached 12 feet above the floor, proving he had almost reached the point where rescue would have been possible if someone had lowered a rope. But no one lowered a rope. The visitors had already gone home to their families, leaving Volkov to claw at ice walls with his bare hands until exhaustion and hypothermia finally killed him. The blood DNA analysis confirmed he was conscious and actively trying to escape less than 6 hours before his death. The most heartbreaking evidence came from analyzing the final photographs more closely. Frame 34, taken 2 frames before the visitor appeared, shows Volkov's own shadow on the crevassed wall. The shadow's position indicates he was waving his arms above his head, the universal distress signal for mountain rescue. He was actively signaling for help when the visitors arrived. They saw him calling for rescue and chose to ignore his pleas. Frame 35, the last photograph before the visitor image, shows Volkov's emergency mirror positioned to reflect sunlight toward the crevasse opening. The mirror was standard rescue, equipment designed to signal aircraft or ground teams from long distances. The reflection pattern captured in the photograph proves the mirror was functioning perfectly and would have been visible from the visitor's position. They could not have missed his desperate attempts to attract their attention. The emergency mirror evidence destroys any possibility that the visitors were unaware of Volkov's situation. He was using every signal method available to indicate he needed immediate rescue. The mirror flashes would have been bright enough to see from half a mile away in clear mountain air. The visitors had to deliberately avoid looking at his signals to claim they did not understand his need for help. The camera's light meter readings during frame 35 show the mirror was reflecting direct sunlight at maximum intensity. The mathematical calculations prove the reflected beam would have struck the visitor's position with enough brightness to cause temporary blindness if they looked directly at it. They experienced physical discomfort from Volkov's rescue signals and still chose to abandon him. But the most damning evidence was hidden in the camera's automatic exposure system. The Nikon F3 adjusted its settings based on available light, and frame 36 shows exposure compensation that indicates a large reflective surface near the visitor's position. They were carrying polished metal equipment that caught sunlight, equipment that forensic analysis identified as standard rescue gear. They had everything needed to save Volkov's life and were displaying it openly while choosing not to use it. The reflected light patterns in frame 36 match the signature of aluminum rescue stretchers, stainless steel carabiners, and chrome-plated ice axes. The visitors were not just equipped for rescue operations, they were carrying enough gear to evacuate multiple victims from complex mountain emergencies. Volkov's situation would have been considered routine for personnel with that level of equipment. The stretcher evidence is particularly damning because Soviet rescue stretchers in 1987 were designed specifically for crevasse evacuations. They included built-in pulley systems that allowed a single rescuer to lift an injured person from depths up to 200 feet. The visitors could have completed Volkov's rescue in less than 30 minutes using equipment they were already carrying. The technical specifications of 1987 Soviet rescue gear prove the visitors had multiple options for saving Volkov's life. Their ice axes could have been anchored into the snow to create secure belay points. Their carabiners could have been connected to form pulley systems. Their rope could have been rigged for mechanical advantage that would have made lifting Volkov effortless, even with his additional weight from broken bones and equipment. Everything they needed was right there in their hands. Everything except the willingness to use it. The psychological profile of the visitors becomes even more disturbing when analyzed in the context of Soviet rescue training protocols. Mountain rescue personnel were required to complete psychological evaluations that specifically tested their response to life-threatening emergencies. They were trained to override personal comfort and safety concerns when human life was at stake. The visitors had been professionally conditioned to save lives in exactly this type of situation. Their abandonment of Volkov represents a complete rejection of their training, their oath of service, and their basic human decency. They were not untrained civilians who panicked or became overwhelmed by the situation. They were professionals who looked at a routine rescue scenario and chose to commit murder instead. The equipment positioning visible in frame 36 reveals additional evidence of the visitors' professional background. Their gear was organized and distributed according to standard Soviet rescue protocols, with weight-bearing equipment on the left side and communication devices on the right. This arrangement was taught exclusively to certified rescue personnel and was not common knowledge among recreational climbers. The visitors were not just trained rescuers. They were recently trained rescuers whose muscle memory still followed current protocols. They had completed certification courses within the previous 12 months, which means their abandonment of Volkov violated fresh training that specifically emphasized the moral and legal obligations of rescue personnel. The legal analysis of their actions confirms that abandonment of a rescue victim was considered murder under Soviet law in 1987. The criminal code specifically addressed situations where trained personnel encountered citizens in life-threatening emergencies. Failure to render aid when capable of doing so carried penalties equivalent to voluntary manslaughter, with sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years in prison. The visitors knew they were committing a capital crime when they walked away from Volkov's crevasse. They understood the legal consequences of their actions and chose to proceed anyway. This was not a moment of weakness or poor judgment. This was a calculated decision to commit murder and accept the legal responsibility for their crime. The cover-up evidence suggests the visitors had advanced knowledge that their crime would not be prosecuted. The misdirection of search efforts, the falsification of personnel reports, and the suppression of radio communications required coordination from multiple government agencies. The visitors were protected by a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Soviet Mountain Rescue Administration. Someone with authority over the investigation had already decided that Volkov's death would be classified as an accident before his body was even discovered. The visitors were given permission to commit murder with the knowledge that they would face no consequences for their actions. The administrative records from 1987 show anomalous personnel transfers immediately after Volkov's disappearance. 4 rescue team members were reassigned to distant posts without explanation. 2 supervisors took early retirement despite being years away from pension eligibility. 1 radio operator was transferred to a desk job after 15 years of field experience. The personnel movements follow the exact pattern used to relocate witnesses and participants after classified government operations. Someone was systematically removing people who had knowledge of Volkov's real fate from positions where they could reveal the truth. The visitors were not just murderers. They were government assets whose crime was being concealed by state resources. The financial records from the period show unusual equipment purchases by rescue units in the region. Large orders for rope, carabiners, and ice axes were placed immediately after Volkov's death, suggesting that evidence had been disposed of and needed to be replaced. Someone was destroying the physical proof that could have connected the visitors to their crime. The equipment disposal was so thorough that no rescue gear from the 1987 training exercises still exists in government storage. Everything was either destroyed, sold, or transferred to locations where it could not be examined by investigators. The visitors' tools of murder were erased from the historical record along with their victim. But they could not erase frame 36. They could not destroy the evidence that Volkov captured in his final moments of hope before realizing he had been abandoned to die. The photograph remains as permanent testimony to their crime, proof that 2 people looked down at a dying man and chose to become killers. The camera that captured their image has been examined by forensic specialists from 12 countries. Every analysis reaches the same conclusion. The visitors were real, they were equipped for rescue, and they consciously chose to let Volkov die. The evidence is unambiguous, the crime is undeniable. Somewhere in Russia, 2 people are living with the knowledge that they committed the perfect murder. They have families who do not know their true nature. They have friends who trust them with their lives. They may have saved other people in other emergencies, building reputations as heroes while carrying the secret that they once chose to be killers. They know that Dmitry Volkov called their names when he saw them at the crevasse edge. They know he thanked them for finding him and begged them to hurry because he was so cold and hurt. They know he promised to recommend them for medals if they could just get him out of the ice, and they know they looked into his eyes and chose to let him freeze to death alone in the dark because saving his life would have been inconvenient.